Hey free-to-play gang, welcome back to another video. So I know I'm very late to this patch update details, and that's because I'm currently traveling, and I know all of you guys already know what are the changes to the Espers so far. But if you still do not know about the patch update details, or you want my opinion on the new changes, then stick around for the entire video to know a little bit more about my opinions on the 10 Espers that will receive some major changes. But before we begin, I'd like to invite you to subscribe if you have not already done so. Subscribing is free, and you can always change your mind afterwards. So I'm going to give my quick opinions on each of these Espers, starting with Cecilia. So this is a well-needed buff. Ability 2, previously when Cecilia dies, this is her passive, heals all team members for 15% of max HP and revives all dead allies with HP equal to 15% of max HP, increasing all team members AP by 50%. This passive can only be triggered once per battle. Now in the upcoming 3.0.0 update, when Cecilia dies, revives all dead allies with HP equal to 15% of max HP and grants a shield to all team members equal to 50% of their max HP for one turn. Afterwards, you increase all team members AP by 50%. So the only main change that I can see over here is that you're giving your allies a 50% HP shield. And this is going to be massive because right now there is an opportunity for you to come back with a counter cleave. So Cecilia is probably going to be really useful in PvP again. So to all of you Cecilia holders out there, this can be very exciting news for you. This is definitely a buff. Now with all of these changes, I'm definitely going to update my tier list again, but more info on that when I return from my holidays. And the second change, this is extremely exciting to me personally because I fully built my Jin Yuyao. So previously she was only really good with the previous Astro Witchcraft before it was nerfed, but with the upcoming update I think she's going to be extremely powerful. We can skip ability 1 because there's not much of a difference over here, but ability 2, this is the important one. So previously you are immune to all disables and you increase your AP by 10% per debuff cast on any ally. So currently if your team receives an AoE debuff, let's say Gabriel's AoE or Longmian's AoE freeze, then your Jin Yuyao will take a turn and cleanse all of that from your allies with a third skill, and then you can counter cleave that way. But now there is a big change to ability 2. So you are currently still immune to disables, but removes a random debuff other than immobile from all ally Espers at the start of each turn, which I assume is each of her turn, and heals them for 5% of their max HP. Increases AP by 20% when an ally Esper receives a debuff. Can only be triggered once per turn. While previously she can gain up to 40% of AP if every one of the allies receives one debuff, which may seem like a nerf because now she can only obtain up to 20% AP once per turn, but the 20% is actually enough because when you start the round, your AP is pretty much almost at 100%. So now she has the same passive effects as Catherine, which is what makes Catherine so good, although Catherine also removes immobile effects. But the thing is, if you're running tanky comps as the round progresses, you would be able to upkeep your team by removing all the defense breaks, all the attack debuffs, and all the disease debuffs as well, which would make your team so much tankier. Plus you gain that extra 5% heal on every turn. The only downside that I can see to this change is that you will no longer be passing all of those debuffs that you had onto the enemies with your third skill, because you would have already cleansed one from each of your allies. But you can still transfer the stuns, which I think is the best debuff to pass on. Next for Biondina, I've actually predicted this in the Sienna patch. So ability 1 is going to increase the damage dealt by 50% if the enemy is unbuffed, whereas for ability 3, you are going to be penalized slightly less when the enemies are buffed. So this is 100% a buff to Biondina and I'm really happy about it. Moving on, next we have Alexa. Now this is a complete shift in her kit. So I think previously I talked about her being a pretty decent stripper, but now her second ability is completely shifted. So take a look at the Ascension portion of her new skill. In the upcoming patch, she will balance all ally Espers' HP ratios, and furthermore, if a target has the Kiss of the Nightingale buff, you then restore 20% of their max HP and reduces all ability cooldowns by one turn. So this is a really big change and I would not consider this either a buff or a nerf, but with this new second ability, she will be very useful against single target damage nukers, because right now you can mitigate single target damage by balancing out all your Esper's HP. So she's gonna be a more defensive support, and I think she's gonna have a lot of use, especially in PvP and the Temporal Tower and the Cube Miracle. Moving on, next we have Falken. This is huge. Okay, so previously one of the patches was supposed to push Falken in this direction, but the developers actually turned tail and changed their mind when the patch actually released, so we did not get this buff. However, this is a weaker version of what was advertised previously, which is a 100% chance to counter-attack incoming attacks. But maybe to make it a little bit more clear to you guys, let's take a look at his new ability 2. Horus attacks mark the target with the Eye of Horus for one turn. Allied Espers other than Horus have a 60% chance of counter-attacking when being hit by enemies with this mark. So this is potentially going to be very useful in Ritual Miracles, because all Ritual Miracles do AoE attacks, which could potentially trigger your entire team to counter-attack. And this will be exceptionally useful in the Fafnir boss. He could also potentially be very irritating in PvP when used very well. Cause I think as long as you have some Espers that can strip buffs, you can potentially be landing a lot of debuffs with your counter attacks. His third skill also received a buff, which is to deal an additional 15% of Horus lost HP in damage, and considering that he is a taunter, he is sure to lose a lot of HP, so he could potentially be doing some decent damage, but I don't think it's gonna be a lot. Still, this is a major buff, and I think he has one of the biggest buffs in this patch. He's definitely going to go up from C tier for me, and we will talk more about where I'm going to place him next in an upcoming tier list video. Next one we have Djoser. He also received a buff. So previously his ability to stacks Bull Rages whenever he receives attacks up to 10 stacks. And each stack grants him 10% defense and an additional 5% resist. However, in the upcoming patch, he will then gain an additional turn upon stacking 10 Bull Rages. This is really useful in my opinion, especially for PvP, because this allows you to time your ability 3 when you need it the most. And speaking of ability 3, he also received a buff on that skill. So previously he just deals damage based on defense, and he taunts the enemy for 2 turns, and he recovers HP based on the Bull Rages that he has. But now he does an additional 50% damage if he has 10 Bull Rages. So if you manual play, you can time this perfectly, and you could potentially steal a turn when you stack 10 Bull Rages just to land a skill 3 and take out one of their DPS Espers. So I think this is a really good buff that he has, and I think he can potentially be quite powerful in PvP. But I'm not gonna say that he's strong right now, and I'll need to do some tests before I can come to that conclusion. But nonetheless, this is a very strong buff. Esper number 7, we have Louis. Now basically ability 1 no longer has an Ascension effect. His baseline is simply the Ascension effect itself. So the main change comes from his second ability. So previously, damage dealt to the target ignores 10% of the defense per debuff the target carries, which was pretty good but very hard to apply in Fafnir because Fafnir is always immune. But currently, each attack has a 15% chance of dealing true damage equal to 10% of the target's max HP, up to 100% of Louis' attack. And this trigger chance increases to 30% upon dealing a crit. So now he's potentially going to be very strong in Fafnir because he no longer has a condition for him to fulfill in order for him to ignore defense. And even though he's not really dealing ignore defense damage, but true damage is still going to be quite powerful because he's dealing multi-hits. And this means that each hit is going to do a true damage factor equal to 10% of the target's max HP. Which means that if RNG serves you well, with his third skill, you can potentially deal up to 90% of the target's max HP, up to 900% of Louis' attack. So this is definitely a buff, especially for the Fafnir boss, and he's gonna make Fafnir so much easier. Now, Esper number 8, we have Anesidora. Now, her third skill has an added effect, which grants her a bonus turn after using her third skill, and this makes her so much more useful in PvP. So previously, the enemies will have to take 2 turns before the effect goes off on each of them, but now that you can potentially sneak in a second skill after using a third skill, you can instantly snipe the enemy. So I do use Anesidora a lot in the Temporal Tower, so I feel that she has a lot more potential in the Temporal Tower. However, I don't think a lot changes for her. She can potentially just stun one target and deal 50% of their HP in one go. So it's not too broken as a nuke, okay? You can't really just snipe one target immediately from 100% to 0%. But there will be one extra reason why I think this will make her a lot better, and that's because now she instantly reduces her third skill's cooldown by 1. So essentially, she has a 3-turn cooldown on her third skill, which would make her really useful. But we'll first have to see whether the game sneakily increases her cooldown by 1 to 5 turns. And if so, she becomes a little bit better but not too broken. Next we have Pritzker. So for his first ability, instead of a silence, you now inflict a stun, which is definitely a lot better. And as for his passive ability 2, which bypasses immunity, to explain this in simple terms, when Pritzker's turn ends, if any enemy on the field is disabled, their cooldown increases by 1. But right now it is slightly different, but I think this is much better. So if Pritzker inflicts any kind of debuff, it doesn't have to be immobilized, then all the immobilized enemies will have their ability cooldowns increased by 1 turn. But what I don't really understand here is that all of Mimir's debuffs are all stuns, and in fact the only other debuff that you can potentially land that isn't a stun would be the Freezing Relic set, which is still an immobilize. So I think I'm likely missing something here, but I'm pretty sure that there may be a chance that you can transfer debuffs, or let's say when you're in Cube Miracle you can land specific additional debuffs that you will not otherwise land, so maybe that's where he becomes more useful. But regardless, I like to see what happens when you multi-stun targets. Would you then increase the cooldowns by so many levels? So we'll have to see about that, but just as how it is right now, this will be a buff. Finally, for the 10th Esper, we have Dhalia, who is the Ripple Dimension Esper. So there is one main change in ability 2, which is if the enemy is already afflicted with a speed down, then ability 2 has a chance to inflict freeze. So essentially, if you inflict slow on one of your first 2 attacks of your ability 2, then your third attack will inflict freeze. So it's an instant freeze for you on one skill. This may potentially be a little bit useful in PvP, but honestly there are much better crowd control debuffers out there. So for example, Kaylee is a much better AoE debuffer, so I don't think this is too crazy. But look at ability 3, this is where she gets really insane. So previously she grants the entire team with 25% AP and crit rate up for 2 turns, which is really not good because I've said before, crit rate buff is not a good buff unless you are using it on yourself. So characters like Lewis can really benefit from crit rate buff because then they do not need to build with too much crit rate. But if your crit rate is dependent on a crit rate buff that belongs to another Esper, then you will be overly reliant on that Esper for every single content that you're running your DPS with. But without going on a tangent, let's take a look at her new ability 3. So previously, nothing changes except that right now you give an additional attack up buff to your entire team for 2 turns. Now we are talking, okay? So we can totally just ignore the fact that there's a crit rate up buff. We can focus more on the attack up buff and how this is so strong for Nama. She is essentially an irreplaceable unit with Nama, and I think Nama will be the only exception that you can rely crit rate on Dhalia. But of course, this doesn't mean that Dhalia is only useful for Nama. She is going to be essential for almost all kinds of speed cleave PvP comps, and Dhalia being only 4 speed slower than the fastest Esper in the game is good enough, in my opinion, to be run as the fastest Esper on your team, to therefore build your AP quickly at the start. Otherwise, if you're running her with Unas, this is even better. You can run Unas as the fastest Esper, followed by Dhalia. So she has a lot of use right now, not even just in PvP in my opinion. So even in Temporal Tower, if you're using Freeze, she can be a little bit useful in that sense. But I think she has a lot of potential in Chronos as well. So that'll be it for this video. It went on much longer than I expected. And if you do have any questions for me, feel free to leave it down in the comment section below. I will get back to you as soon as I can. You know that I respond to all comments. And if you find that you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more Dislyte content. So this has been free to play by the way, and I'm gonna go ahead and enjoy my holiday. And as always, I will see you in the next video.